Welcome to Pay Attention, interviews about truth in troubling times. And today I'm here with Dr. Jeremy Holmes, who is a British psychiatrist who lives in London. He trained at Cambridge University and University College London. He currently practices as a consultant psychotherapist in North Devon. He holds the post of visiting professor at University College London and was senior clinical research fellow at Peninsula Medical School until 2003. Jeremy is now retired. He's the author of a number of books, including John Bowlby and Attachment Theory, The Search for the Secure Base, Attachment Theory and Psychotherapy, and Exploring Insecurity, that is, exploring insecurity towards an attachment-informed psychoanalytic psychotherapy. And that book was the winner of the 2010 Goethe Prize for Psychoanalytic and Psychodynamic Scholarship. And it's a book that brings together attachment theory and modern psychoanalytic theory and demonstrates how attachment theory can be used in therapeutic practice. Dr. Holmes also has a brand new book, which we're going to be talking about today, that's just off the press, and it's called The Brain Has a Mind of Its Own, which is a wonderful title. It's about neurobiology, attachment theory, and psychotherapy, and we'll be talking about those topics today. So welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you. Nice to meet you again, Polly, after all these years.
Yes. So it's really lovely to have you here. Many people these days use attachment theory in all sorts of ways in doing psychotherapy and also in thinking about their own couple relationships. And I have been having conversations recently. I had a conversation with Dan Siegel, the psychiatrist who specializes in adolescence and also does research on attachment, about the neurobiology of relationship. Or another way to put it is the aspect of relationship that's grounded in human attachment bonds. And today I'd like to speak to you especially about how our attachment styles affect our relationships to our partners and also to our children and to our adult children. But first, I wanted to just start by talking about some of the concepts in your newest book. And I found that those concepts were fascinating to me because, it seemed as though, and again, many listeners might not know about this, and that is fine not to know about it. But Freud wrote a book called The Project for a Scientific Psychology, or maybe it was just a sort of monograph. And that document is fascinating to a lot of psychoanalysts for a lot of different reasons. And I sort of saw this book as somehow the extension forward of that book. And I'll just ask you first, was that at all in your mind? Or because we're going to go into some of the topics in detail, but was this somehow sort of, bringing the project into the 21st century, or?
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, as you say, Freud wrote his so-called project in 1895 and abandoned it. It was never published. It was only published posthumously. And he really, I think, decided that the current status or state of neurobiology was not sophisticated enough for his purposes. And so he kind of left neurology behind, started off, of course, and trained as a neurologist and as a neurobiologist as well. He was an expert on the brain fibers of lampreys, I believe. So he developed a kind of standalone psychology, which we know as psychoanalysis. But there's been developments, extraordinary developments. Of course, we all know about the extraordinary developments in neuroscience that have happened in the last sort of 30, 40 years. But to my mind, I've always been rather dissatisfied with them, and I've never been fully sort of happy with the direction that so-called neuropsychoanalysis has gone on, because I've tended to think of it as a kind of modern day version of phrenology. In other words, it tells you which bits of the brain light up when you're anxious, let's say, the amygdala, which bits of the brain light up when you're sort of thinking, that's the prefrontal cortex or the right prefrontal cortex, and so on. But I've never felt that it really sort of got to grips with the work that we as psychotherapists and psychoanalysts engage in. And it has a very non-relational quality to it as well. It's really quite monadic. It's about a brain inside, a box, namely the skull, and how the blood flow to that brain varies depending on what that brain is doing. And then so I got very excited by a kind of new development in neuroscience, which is very much associated with a man called Carl Friston. Carl Friston, you mentioned actually in our sort of preliminary conversation about PET scanning and CAT scanning, and he started off life as a kind of mathematician and programmer, and he devised a lot of the software which is used throughout the world in CAT and PET scanning. But he's also trained as a psychiatrist, and he's developed a kind of model of brain function, which I suddenly realized was very relevant to the work we do as psychotherapists. And there are sort of one or two or three or four kind of basic principles that, if you like, I can expand them now. Do you want me to talk about them right now?
No, I'd like to take a moment just to build a little bit more about what you've just said, and then ask you a little bit about the issue of energy, because I'd like to go there before we go into the various, I'm going to call them acronyms, that have to do with the model. But first, I wanted to say that I'm glad to hear you say that, because also I've had a lot of concern about in the mindfulness world, which I'm very much involved with now, maybe more than the psychoanalytic world, the turn towards these these sort of functional MRIs. And then many, many different scans of people's brains when they're practicing this kind of meditation or that kind, or when they're, using self-compassion and so on. I mean, after a while, it's a sort of so what, because it seems as though what we're really kind of mapping is something that's inside of the head instead of something that's between people. And I've always had the sense that the mind is not inside of anybody's head. It's an interactive process because it involves culture, it involves language, it involves lots and lots of things that we build into what we call the mind.
Well, what we call the extended mind sort of theory, EMT, is, there's an acronym, perhaps we should avoid it, but you're absolutely right. And we live in a sort of this kind of, I think it's a part of the general zeitgeist and the general culture that somehow everything needs to kind of have a kind of material basis to it. And so it is useful if you want to generate funds for mindfulness research to show that actually it does make a difference to what's going on in the brain. And the same applies to psychoanalytic or to all forms of psychotherapy, CBT as well. So one can't not use it, but actually in terms of its explanatory power, I think it's rather weak.
Right. I do too. And I think that it is true that in these recent times, it's impossible to talk about psychotherapy, relationship, or anything without putting up a diagram of the brain. I mean, it's just part of what I would call the sort of myth of our time. Our time really is, we're thinking in terms of things are founded in the brain. But I laugh a little bit because I like very much the idea that we, there's a philosopher who recently wrote a book that, we get out of our heads. And he's one of the people who is involved in neurobiology and neuroscience. And that, the whole thing of mental process and any kind of relational interaction is in fact deeply interactive. And most of the technology really can't, now, and perhaps it's different now, but it wasn't possible to do an interactive fMRI where there are two people.
Well, you can now begin to do it, and you can even, wire up little babies. It doesn't harm them in any way. But and see what kinds of the ways in which babies and mums' brains interact with one another. But no, you're absolutely right. It is well, as we agree that
yes, we agree.
Much as we love neurobiology, it is somewhat non-interactional, and that's when I start to talk about the model that I think has huge relevance to psychoanalytic work. We'll see that actually has a very strong relational component to it.
Wonderful. So I just want to start, though, with this idea that your new book, you're conceiving of something that's a little bit like libido or psychic energy. That's what Jung called it, life energy. It was this idea of energy was something that both Freud and Jung imagined might actually be somehow able to be a part of the psychology of the science of psychology as a science. And Freud called this libido, Jung called it psychic energy. They connected it to something like, I would say, interest or engagement or vitality, or, some people would even use the term eros because of the engagement. And there are names for something like this life energy, like an élan vital or chi or ki in Eastern medicine as well. And I wondered if you could explain the way that you're talking about energy right now, and how you would delineate that concept or notion in such a way that makes it suitable maybe to psychoanalysis, psychotherapy,
right.
Interactive process.
Yes, I mean, Freud was kind of, although he abandoned his project, Freud, actually had lots of different theories that kind of overlapped throughout his intellectual life, and he hung on in a way to the idea of energy, which he called Q in the project, and that really turned into libido, and he never really let go of it, and then he never really let go of the idea of libido right into the end of his life. So yes, energy was very important to Freud, and he had this kind of, I've always thought he really based his theory on, given the fact that he saw sexuality as one of the sort of crucial aspects of humanity, that he had this idea that our aim, as it were, is to reduce energy, to discharge energy. And so you could sort of see, in a way, it's a kind of orgasm model of energy. The build-up of energy he saw, and then it's discharged. And he then viewed psychopathology in terms of sort of energy that hasn't been discharged and gets turned into somatic symptoms. That was his kind of basic model that I think he sort of developed at the end of the 19th century. Now we've got to fast forward, because of course things like élan vital are kind of taboo in scientific circles. In other words, no one has ever demonstrated there's some kind of mysterious force which pertains to living creatures and doesn't pertain to non-living creatures. So living creatures obey the rules of physics and chemistry, and I think there's no question that that is the case. So what is it? What is this mysterious energy that people are talking about? And I think the best way to think about that, is there a third term between mind and body, as it were? Because mind is immaterial. So what is mind? If it's and although we can say mind, the sort of substrate of mind is electronic activity in neurons, obviously mind and phenomenology and our experience of the world, the redness of red, as some people put it, is something that sort of somehow seems in a different sphere to the sphere of the physicochemical and biochemical movements in our neurons. The way I like to look at this is, and I think this is consistent with Carl Friston's modeling, is that we're really talking about information. And information is pattern. And when we talk about energy, we're talking about pattern. And that immediately brings us to two kinds of energy. And this goes again right back to Freud: energy bound and energy unbound. And what the sort of what I call the Fristonian model, the model of the brain that I think is relevant to our work, The idea is, if you just think, let's just think about what it is to be a living creature. You are bombarded by sensations. And these sensations come from the outside, in terms of our five senses. They also come from inside, from our proprioceptors, from our gut, from our heart. And these, you can see that we are, as it were, being provided with information about the world via our senses. So, and that applies to the external world and to the internal world. Now, where I think one place in which the free energy principle has turned things on their head to some extent is that we have to think and realize that actually we create our own worlds. So the brain, top down, has to make some kind of sense of all this buzzing, booming, to use the William James phrase, input from its sensations. So it has, as it were, it's built up through experience, a prior model or picture of what the world is like. And what it's interested in, essentially, is what's new, what's informative. So here we are sitting, I'm sitting here, and what's relevant? So I'm here sitting, talking to you. Well, first of all, I recognize you because I met you all those years ago. So therefore, in one sense, I've got a kind of model, a poly model in my mind, which I then sort of apply to the sensations I'm getting through my visual system. So I don't have to get too I don't have to attend too much to that. Behind you, there's a plant, you're sitting on a chair. That's not particularly relevant to the conversation that we're having. So I don't particularly attend to that. So in a way, I'm on the one hand, I'm taking these sensations and I'm just aligning them with my pre-existing models of the world. And I'm looking out for what is new and different. So I'm looking out for information, because what's new and different is information. I sometimes, an awful lot of people play Scrabble. And if you think about the difference between a Scrabble piece that's, let's say, an E, which has a 1 on it, so you're only going to get 1 point for E, or an X, which is 10. Now, what's the difference? Well, the X conveys a lot more information. There are relatively few words that contain the letter X, whereas there's thousands of words that contain the letter E. So we're all the time, as it were, trying to maximize the information. Now, so the basic idea is that we are all the time, as it were, binding the information, the energy that comes from the external world and the internal world along the lines of our pre-existing models.
So
and that's where, so energy is either bound or unbound, and unbound energy is kind of, it represents chaos, whereas bound energy corresponds with our pre-existing models of the world. And what we're looking for, as it were, is to always modify our pre-existing models of the world, so that they can take account of the energy that comes in. So we bind it by building more complex models of our existence all the time. So the complexity of my knowledge. So when we first started talking, Polly, all I had was my pre-existing knowledge of you. Already, my picture of Polly has become more complex because I've listened to what you've been saying. I've as it were, modified my model of Polly in terms of the conversation which we've had. And that process is going on all the time. And
So could I ask you one thing in here, because I in following you and also in understanding this way of speaking about information, because I've heard others speak about it this way, it was a little sort of threw me at first, because I think of information as bits of stuff, rather than, let's say, the way you're talking about it. And I want to get back to the free energy principle too, because you've brought it in already. But it does remind me of Piaget's ideas of assimilation and accommodation as ways that children grow and develop with what he called their schemas or their schematas of the world. So, they assimilate to whatever model they're using, even in a sensory motor world. They're grasping and pushing and pulling. And so their senses are allowing them to organize according to the model. So he calls that assimilation. And then when they can't do that anymore, they have to change the model slightly. And he calls that accommodation. So
well, I see that. I read, I mean, I totally agree with you, and I think it's entirely consistent with Piaget. I've always understood this accommodation, assimilation in a slightly different way. I see it as a digestive model, and that if you want to learn, the first thing you do, as it were, is to get as close as you possibly can to the sort of pedagogic source. Obviously, for a child, it's going to be the parent or your siblings, etc. So you, as it were, watch what they're doing. And you get as close to them as you possibly can. And then you, as it were, absorb that and make it your own. And the digestive model is, what do we do with our food? We put our food into our digestive tract. Well, actually, the gut is outside the body. It's just a tube outside the body. But we get incredibly close to it. So that's the accommodation. And then we absorb it, we break it down, we assimilate, and we turn it in. You are what you eat. You turn it into itself. And I have always thought of Piaget's sort of model of learning as being a little bit like, the little daughter who tries on her mother's shoes. So she's accommodating, as it were. She's getting very close to her mother. She's putting her feet in the same place that her mother puts her feet. And then she's, as it were, making her mother into herself. So she then has an internal object. Now, what I think is interesting about what you said, and it's relevant to the free energy model, is that the Piagetian child is incredibly active. The Piagetian child is constantly, is a little scientist. That's how Piaget is.
Yes, right.
And so that's hugely important to the free energy model, because in that, the subject is an agent. The subject is all the time, as it were, trying to increase their adaptation to the environment they find themselves in. And in order to do that, they need to find out more and more about that environment. So they explore it. And through their actions, they then, as it were, develop a more complex and a more adaptive model of the world. So there are two sort of, in this process of free energy minimization, there are two processes at work. One is agency and action, and at the other end is model revision. And between the two of them, we're constantly, as it were, becoming more adapted to the environments we find ourselves in, and our models of the world. And I mean, another aspect of Piaget is that he obviously is mainly interested in cognitive development. Yes. But all this that I'm talking about applies to affective life as well. So we're all the time, as it were, trying to find out what we're feeling, what others are feeling, and to develop more, if you like, accurate sort of pictures of how we're feeling and how other people are feeling. Now, my idea is that in psychopathology, when people are suffering from psychological difficulties, these processes are, for various reasons, inhibited or blocked, so that it's much more difficult for people to feel that they are agents, that they are active, that they are authors of their own life, that they can, as it were, alter or affect their environments. And equally, they tend to cling on to pre-existing models of the world and to find it very difficult, as it were, to feel it's safe to change or alter or modify those models. That's where attachment comes in, and that's where relational neuroscience comes in. But I know I'm rushing ahead of your questions.
Well, let's spend a moment. I want to go rushing, and I like rushing actually, but I don't want to lose anything along the way. Just in the sense that when I've talked with a lot of people about things like confirmation bias and things like predictive errors and so on. And I know that your prediction error minimization somehow fits into all of that. So I wanted to just return to one more thing about Piaget. And Piaget was, I'm a developmental psychologist and a neo-Piagetian, you might say, by my background and training. but that was way back when I was an academic and so on. But Piaget was the thing that I think is fascinating and sort of maps similarly to your system. He really was asking the question, how is it that children learn about time, space, and causality, never having been acquainted with those principles or with language or culture? Like, how do they build a model in which they can recognize, because they can recognize something like, a means to an end pretty quickly before they're into language and so on. And what he said was they interact with the dimensions of the physical world. And of course, they're interacting with attachment figures at the same time. But that pushing and pulling and grasping and pushing away and so on starts to give them the dimensions of the physical world we live in without any concept of it. So they're sort of building it from the bottom up, so to speak, And to me, that way of understanding how we interact, that we're pushing and pulling on our experience, we're grasping it or pushing it away, and then we're finding the patterns and where they match or where they don't match what we already have, let's say, understood as the model for whatever it is, whether it's affective or cognitive. And it seems to me that this model, or this term PEM, prediction error minimization, seems to fit with defense mechanisms, adaptive mechanisms, and so on, and psychotherapy, psychoanalysis. I'm just wanting to be sure that I'm on the right track in thinking this way, and then also to have you then talk about the PEM so that people can understand it, and to say whether we've sort of got the free energy principle down already. Do we have enough of that down that we will be able to use it?
Just to go back to what you were saying about, yes, the child, the Piagetian child, who, as I was saying, is a sort of a mini scientist, as it were. They're learning physics, they're learning chemistry, they're learning space, they're learning time. And the way they're doing it is through interacting with the world, interacting with others, pushing and pulling, to use your lovely way of putting it. Now, I think, and yet, so a 3-year-old, knows nothing about Newton's laws of motion, or wouldn't be able to enunciate them, and yet, they know jolly well that if they, push a ball, it'll roll across the room. And that, I think, brings me to another aspect of this model that I'm trying to sort of promote, which is the idea of a hierarchy. In other words, this interaction between what I call bottom-up, sensations coming from the outside, and the top-down models that we, as it were, apply to them, it's not a kind of one-off thing. It doesn't just happen at the surface of our bodies. It happens throughout the brain at different levels. And so I would say that and this is of course highly relevant to psychotherapy, that the process, as it were, of thinking about thinking is another level of the hierarchy. And the same principles apply. You've got bottom up, top down. So that little 3-year-old, when he or she, starts learning physics age 10, suddenly it sort of realizes that what we would say intuitively know, they know in their bones and in their body, can actually be sort of encapsulated in a precept which exists at a much higher level of the hierarchy. And again, I think this is pretty relevant to both to psychoanalytic work or psychotherapeutic work, but it's also relevant, I think, to the world of spirit, let's put it like that, or world of religion, because in the end, the precepts which govern our sort of spiritual and religious life are these very, very high level concepts, sort of the golden rule, let's say, in Christianity would be an example of that. It's analogous to Newton's laws of motion at a kind of, if we think about it in this hierarchical way. Now let's get back to prediction. I haven't said anything about prediction, but a basic principle behind the whole, this new way of looking at things is what's called Bayesian probabilities. And it's a very simple idea, which is that we have no idea, we can have no idea what's going to happen next. And yet, in order to sort of exist in the world, we need to know what's going to happen next. And therefore, we have to make predictions. And we make the predictions on the basis of prior experience. And those predictions are inevitably, in some instances, going to be wrong. There's going to be inevitably going to be errors in them. Now, obviously, we can think about, well, what are we predicting? Well, I mean, if you're a newborn baby, you've no idea that the sun, invariably rises in the east. And all you can say is on day 2 of your life, well, it rose in the east yesterday. So on the basis of that very limited experience, I'm going to have a look eastwards when the sun rises today and see if there was an error in my prediction. So the idea of prediction error minimization is that built into the sort of our way of living in the world is the idea that we're all the time trying to predict what someone's, what's going to happen next, what someone's going to say next, what you're going to feel next. And simultaneously, we are, as it were, trying to minimize the mistakes that we're going to make. And we minimize those mistakes, to repeat what I've already said, in 2 ways. One, through action, through observation, through agency, or to use your lovely sort of phrase, through pushing and pulling on the world. Because we'll know the world better, and therefore we'll be able to make better predictions about the world to the extent that we push or pull on it. But having done that, pushing and pulling, we then have to alter our models of the world. So we sort of, as it were, say, well, we can kind of pull a balloon, but we can't pull a lead weight because we've tried it out. And again, I would say that this process of prediction error minimization can, as it were, go wrong in a psychological illness. And conversely, in ways that perhaps we'll come on to in a while, some of the procedures and one wants to call it the techniques of psychoanalysis are designed to sort of activate and facilitate prediction error minimization in people for whom that process has in some way run into difficulties.
Could we stop for a moment here and just sort of emphasize that this prediction error minimization, actually, it's kind of aiming at getting a model that suits our experience, and yet it also constrains the way that we can perceive things. That, I mean, to sort of try to explain a little bit around the idea of confirmation bias, which is a term, again, that I've thrown around a lot in these interviews because there's a lot of what I would call blah blah about confirmation bias right now, because it fits with a lot of political issues and lots of things that are out there in the world that people tend to, and I think there's a lot of research on it, and it spans many fields. There's quite a bit of philosophy about it, that people tend to err on the side of, make mistakes on the side of assuming that they already know, or let's say assimilation, rather than accommodation. There was a psychologist named Jack Block who for years was working on a particular aspect of multivariate analysis, basically, the Q sort. And he came up with this phrase that people assimilate when they can and they accommodate when they must. In other words, it's like we in the digestion model, you take in a lot and you try to digest it and make it your own, and you stop doing that only when you have to. That idea of moving along and saying, yeah, I've got this, I've got this, I've got this. Oh, I can't get it. So I wonder if you can prediction error minimization, because it sounds very abstract, can you help people see how it gets past just that sort of thing of
Right.
predicting, just based on the experience you already had. I think it's a more complex interaction than just that. I mean, it's setting up a dynamic.
You brought up the question of confirmation bias, and there are two aspects to this that I wanted to bring up. One was, or two concepts, that I think are sort of relevant, familiar to various familiar sort of psychoanalytic concept of splitting, or paranoid schizoid as Klein's like to call it on the one hand, and projective identification. So let's start with sort of splitting. Splitting, I would say, is a kind of simplistic way of dividing the world up, good guys and bad guys, in order, as it were, to survive in the environment in which you find yourself, and to sort of you bring your model of the world, the pre-existing model of the world, and you need to do, as it were, to shut out an awful lot of information, which will tend, as it were, to disconfirm this prediction that you're making about the world, which is that all Biden supporters are not to be trusted and they've rigged the elections. You have to, as it were, not explore, not do your push-pull, repress from your mind or switch out of your mind any evidence to the contrary. So you end up, as it were, with a way of surviving in the world, but it's a very simplistic one, and one which, as it were, restricts your freedom. And another way, as it were, of living in this world is, as it were, and we're all familiar with this, and particularly with social media, is, as it were, to find an environment which reinforces your confirmation bias. In other words, and in a sense, that's what projective identification, the concept of projective identification, psychoanalysis is, that, as it were, you induce those around you to conform to your model of the world, so that if you feel that people are abusive and untrustworthy, you then, as it were, seek out people who possibly are abusive and untrustworthy, and if they aren't, you, as it were, induce them to be like that, so that then confirms this top-down model of the world. So I think what you're saying is highly relevant. And again, I would see in the consulting room, as it were, what we're trying to help our patients to do is to develop more complex models of themselves and of their relationships and of the people that they're intimate with, and ultimately of the world. Now, whether that applies at can apply at a political level, maybe it can, because I know that you're very interested in getting people with, I know we're going off to a slight tangent, but I'm very interested in what you're doing, which is that you're interested in getting people with very divergent views to sit down in the room together and, as it were, start pushing and pulling. In other words, to develop more complex models. And that is, I think that's a kind of therapeutic skill, but that one is definitely all the time doing in the consulting room. But I think what's interesting about what you're doing is you're kind of saying, well, this can work in the political sphere as well. Now, where are we going in the right direction?
Good. Yes, we are. Yes, we are. And I think that, also you've picked up very much the way that it's not just in the political world, but I have tried to bring into couple therapy this absolute focus on projective identification, like that the zero focus, the sort of single-minded focus of something that I do call dialogue therapy is to break up the projective identification so that the two people can create some emotional space in which they're able to actually know each other, is what I call seeing, hearing, and feeling each other, because within projective identification, that that emotional dynamic is narrowed so much, and very often people just keep confirming their worst visions of each other, and then they don't trust each other, and then they're not intimate any longer, and then they really can't have even conversations about decision making because everything devolves back to those sort of frozen models, almost statues of each other. And so bringing this whole framework of projective identification and splitting to the real center of couples therapy is what got me to thinking about using it in the political world, because couples are, it's like being in a war room sometimes to work with couples in therapy. And I have found over time that it is possible to, once the individuals understand to some extent what the bias is that they're bringing, they begin to see that. And if they can see it in regard to their own, let's say, you could call them working models, if you want to use the attachment sort of idea, they're working models for themselves. Once they see those models and they're able to experience in the room the space between them so that they're no longer just projecting and confirming, they have a kind of there's a kind of an aha, there's a kind of almost like a learning moment, oh, you're really not like that. Oh, all along I thought you were just like this. So, that's still a very therapeutic environment. It's a controlled environment. But I have worked in some on some really difficult topics, like, say, vaccine safety, with people who have very opposite beliefs. And my only goal is to get them to see, hear, and feel each other's point of view. So you have to know your own. You have to come to experience your own. And then you have to have the emotional space in which you can actually step into the other person's for a moment, just see it and hear it and feel it. And you start to see, oh, they're human too. They're trying to sort of grapple with the same things. So anyway, I don't want to get too far afield.
Well, no, I'd like to make 2 or 3 comments about what you just said.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my theories about couple therapy and about couples and marriage is that we sort of, there's a kind of therapeutic aspiration in every relationship. And it's you, as it were, you choose someone who kind of represents your core difficulty, but you hope for a different outcome. And it's a little bit, it's a kind of a little bit like transference in psychotherapy, where again, you sort of create the therapist who represents your core difficulty, and then the question arises: can there be a different outcome? Now, I always, it's very relevant to my little sort of model, but there's a kind of, you're probably familiar with this study, but it's one that I love. It's by an attachment theorist called Jim Cohn, who works in Maryland. And it's all to do with relational neuroscience. And I think we're now kind of, let's get on to relational neuroscience a bit. And you may be familiar with this, but people tapping into this video may not be with the study. So I just very briefly tell you the study. It was a study where he decided he wanted to look at the sort of neuroscience of happy coupledom. So he put an advertisement in the local paper for happily married couples, and about 150 people applied. I think it was a small fee. He explained what was going to happen, which was one of the members of the couple was going to be in an MRI scanner. He then developed a kind of questionnaire. He really wanted to pick out the very, very happily married couples. And I always say, well, just for a bit of fun, my wife and I filled in this questionnaire, and unfortunately we would not have been included in the study. But anyway, and he then, the one member of the couple, it was the female member of the couple, I don't quite know why, she went into the MRI scanner under 3 circumstances on her own, holding her husband's hand and holding a stranger's hand. And the MRI was particularly interested in the HPA axis, the sort of arousal, panic, danger arousal part of the brain. And she was just told, in sort of an attachment terms, in a way, she was offered a very mild threat. She said, she was told in the next 20 seconds, you will receive a mild electric shock to your left leg. And then what Jim was interested in was the MRI patterns, depending on whether or not these wives were holding a husband hand or not. And I mean, sort of in a way, unsurprisingly, what he found was that when they were on their own, then the arousal system was activated, and you, as it were, had to be ready to receive whatever threat and danger the world presented to you. When they were holding their husband's hands, their brains just stayed quite quiet. And so this immediately sort of arises or gives one the idea that there are sort of what I call relational neuroscience, that there are links between intimate couples' brains. And so somehow the top-down, the soothing part of the husband's brain, who wasn't going to experience any bottom-up pain, was able to interact with the bottom-up sensations from the wife, and as it were, the free energy was immediately minimized. Whereas if she's on her own, she had to do it herself, and therefore she needed to activate her HPA axis. So now I think the problem with couple therapy and with couples who are at war, of course, is that each of them, as it were, wants the other one to be in this kind of non-involved, soothing role, because they're both so desperate. And I think your techniques and the techniques that generally family therapists and couple therapists use is essentially to kind of train and teach people, as it were, you are now in the role of someone who's just listening and just putting yourself, and then, you know, next time or in half an hour's time, it'll be the other way around, you'll get your turn. Okay, and that then sort of brings us on to, again, back to prediction error minimization, that there are now sort of quite good mathematical models which show that if you can entrain, if you can get two people in sync, in tune in some sort of way, then, as it were, their top-down, bottom-up processes become one. And in everyday and ordinary life, I mean, the example of this is musicians working together, singing together, playing in a string quartet, playing in an orchestra. So, as it were, there is people kind of create what Carl Friston and Frith call duets for one. And what we are trying to do, it seems to be in psychotherapy, in looking at bringing up our children, and in couple therapy, and of course in couple relationships, is, as it were, to, and of course you're not in a duet for one most of the time, but for there be, as it were, a door into the duet for one.
Yes. Yes. Right.
So again, I sort of think that the free energy minimization idea is that this is something that is enhanced by communication with an intimate other, whether that be a therapist, a partner, or a parent. That collaborative free energy minimization is a far more potent and successful process, and you can do it on your own, but it's a lot more difficult, and it takes up a lot more energy, and it's a lot more painful to minimize free energy that way. Now, if you think of, say, people suffering from PTSD, let's say, so here's someone who's had a trauma, some horrible bereavement, some horrible episode of harm, rape, violence, etc. One of the problems with trauma is that we haven't got any kind of pre-existing model. You know, why trauma is so traumatic is that we cannot minimize this free energy. So you're just suffused with free energy. You haven't got a story, as it were, with which to bind that energy. And so the role of the therapist in situations like that is, as it were, to be like the spouse who's holding the partner's hand, who isn't actually themselves traumatized. So they can then provide a kind of top-down model, which can then collaboratively be worked on. So, but one of the basic sort of techniques used in PTSD therapy is simply, as it were, to help the sufferer to tell the story. Now, in EMDR, they tell it to themselves. They don't even tell it aloud, but they're telling it in the context of a holding environment. And in verbal therapy, of course, when they're ready, when the space feels safe enough, then they can begin, as it were, to create a story which will bind that free energy. And just to finish one more point, which I'm kind of pushing in, one of my ideas about dream analysis. Why is dream analysis so important in therapy? Why do we dream? Well, one way of thinking about why we dream, what are dreams? Dreams are stories. There are hundreds and hundreds of stories, which mean, as it were, rather like the immune system, as it were, needs to be able to cope with a whole massive range of different invaders and antigens. Similarly, we need all the time to be generating a kind of bank of stories, which are then going to enable us, as it were, to begin at least to minimize the free energy that the unpredictable world is going to throw at us.
So, I like all of what you're saying. It makes immediate sense for me. And where I would like to go a little bit, if we can, is into the non-ideal situation. I realized even when you mentioned the couples that were the happy couples, and then the grasping of the hand and so on. And I hadn't known the research in detail. I'd really only heard about it or read about it briefly. There's a tendency on the part of I think all of us, but certainly on the part of people who are hoping that romantic love will really help them in life. I mean, there are people who don't really care that much about it, and there are other people that care a lot about it. But I think there's a tendency to think there will be a hand that can hold my hand and will help with the chaotic, sort of stuff, and will help ground me. And whether someone's coming to therapy to get that, or they're seeking it in a couple relationship, often it's really disappointing that hand isn't really doing that, And so people get very thrown by the idea that this should happen, or it should happen when they come to therapy. There should be a grounding, or there should be some kind of match, so that one feels intuitively that this person gets me. And so if you could talk a little bit about the situation of what happens then when we've got a kind of a mismatch, even in a therapy situation where somebody comes in and, I tend to, I'm going to use this more sort of therapeutic language than the language that you're using, and you could maybe translate it back. But, I can tell when I meet with somebody for a consultation or two, something about their defensive system, or what I would simply call the nature of their personality. And sometimes I'm a good fit and sometimes I'm not. But often, I mean, in other words, let's say, if you think of, Freud thought often about Schopenhauer's porcupines, or you simply think about porcupines, like our spikes go up together at the same time, rather than one of us having the spikes going down. I'm calling them spikes, but I've forgotten what they're called actually. But anyway, I can tell when I fit smoothly with somebody or when I don't, but I'm likely to take either case into therapy. I mean, I'm not, if it's something, the only sort of extreme thing that I don't feel I could work with is a great deal of violent crime, but I haven't had many people in Vermont coming anyway for that kind of concern. But so, sometimes I notice at the beginning of therapy for me, I can tell that people are not liking me particularly. I mean, I'm not, let's say, a bowl full of cherries or something. I'm not going to be that grounding hand at the beginning. So it takes us time, but we're doing something together that I would call loosely getting to know each other. But, in a more precise way, I'm actually trying to see how I can sort of come into the organization of the other person's personality in such a way as to create that kind of thing that you're talking about, that we could call, the capacity to, that the other person could assimilate me, or could find a way to feel grounded, so that we then can explore many, many things together. I wonder if you could talk about mostly because I don't want to simply move on thinking that if everybody just took their partner's hand, when they're in a chaotic situation, or if anybody just coming to therapy is going to feel like that's happening, right away. So I hope this is making sense. We're sort
It
of
is. I mean, I think there's some really, again, just commenting on what you're saying. I very much liked what you said about how, your client comes, and some you really feel in tune with, and others possibly not. And both are good reasons for proceeding with therapy. And what needs to be done is to, as it were, subject those feelings to some kind of mutual examination. I mean, I do think to an extent a therapist needs to have a kind of slightly, maybe I'm just speaking about myself, but has to have a slightly chameleon-like quality. Because in order to sort of create any kind of bridge between two people, to sort of open up a channel, one has to, as it were, to kind of speak in the same kind of way, to sort of enter a universe that the client brings with them, and to be able to enter into that universe, one has to in some way adjust. Of course, one still has to retain one's own identity, but in a way that brings me on to our second point, which is ambiguity. And I believe certainly in the analytic model, of course, the client comes into the room and they immediately know lots about you. I mean, they know what your gender is, they know what your age is. They certainly in the UK, where we're highly accent sensitive, they probably know, whether you've been to a public school or not, and what part of the country you've come from. And, they'll observe your room and know sort of roughly what your kind of visual taste is like, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no such thing as a completely blank screen therapist. But on the other hand, there is a kind of ambiguity. There is a kind of, built into our work is reticence. If someone sort of says, I don't know, are you married? Rather than sort of, you could say, well, yes or no, but you might just as easily say, well, that's really interesting. Now I wonder why that's come up in your mind today, right, as it were. I mean, I know that sounds terribly sort of corny, but actually, this ambiguity, I think, is hugely important in the prediction error minimization model, because in order to sort of tap into what are we doing in therapy? Well, I believe what we're doing is we're putting a sort of artificial barrier between this automatic prediction error minimization that we use in order to get through everyday life. So we're all the time, as it were, having sensations from the world, and we're making assumptions about what those sensations mean. And then something goes wrong, someone goes into therapy, and then we've got to say, now let's start, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily say this explicitly, but implicitly, let's start thinking about what assumptions do you bring with you that you use to minimize prediction error. So let's sort of hear, when you sort of say, well, are you married? Let's have a think about, where does that come from? Supposing I was married, supposing I wasn't married, what kind of would be the implications of that for you? And conversely, I mean, I always give this example. I had a patient who suddenly said to me with sort of fury, "You're wearing a wedding ring." And he'd been coming to see me for about 2 years. And in the course of that 2 years, he had never noticed that I was wearing a
Right.
wedding ring. But he'd reached a stage where he could, as it were, begin to contemplate the fact, this is my interpretation anyway, that, as it were, he's going to have to share me with somebody else.
Right. Right.
So what is the prediction error minimization aspect of that? Well, this person, in order to sort of get through his life, he had, as it were, not to think about the fact that other people fall in love, get married, have relationships, made him feel too envious. And so he blocked out or repressed or didn't do the push-pull about a bit of gold on a person's hand. He simply didn't see it.
Yes,
So,
he probably didn't see it. He probably, in fact, did not see it.
Well,
and that's
but
part of his interest.
What you said is so important, because I think most of us either do or have been brought up to think of the brain, the mind, as a kind of camera which simply photographs the world out there. And if it were such an entity, then he would have seen it, because a camera would have seen it. But in fact, in the prediction error minimization model that I'm trying to develop or put forward, in Friston's model of Bayesian prediction, we create the world out of our minds. So you're absolutely right, because he created a world in which there was a therapist who only belonged to him, and that was therefore all that he saw.
Right.
And that's a very simplistic world. And our job, as it were, it seems to me, is to help our clients develop a more complex world in which you're going to cope with the fact that the person that you're emotionally involved with might also be emotionally involved with somebody else, otherwise known as the Oedipal situation.
Right.
So I don't know how quite we got onto this, but it was in response to what you were saying about couples therapy.
I think we got onto it also where there's not an immediate match, where there's not something that seems absolutely congruent at first. And one thing we've got to several things that are important, I think. I mean, something that I'm very steeped in at the moment, because I'm very taken with Donald Hoffman's work, and also with a lot of cognitive scientists who, say that our perceptions of the world around us are highly subjective, somewhere around 85% to 95% subjective, so that we don't necessarily see the same, we're not seeing the moon. I'm seeing my moon, you're seeing your moon. And we have language and other things that would say, well, that overlaps, but it overlaps a lot less than what people have been led to think, And so, yes, I would say your patient really didn't see your ring, from everything I know, until he was ready to see it. And similarly, between couples, there is this space that we try to create in dialogue therapy, so that there is an inquiry, so that there is the possibility of actually perceiving the other person with a degree of curiosity or even a sense of mystery that one would have thought would be impossible after 25 years of being together. Because I'm often seeing couples myself where there's a lack of trust, because there's no way of handling things, even though they've been married for a long time, or they have lots of investment, let's say, in staying together, but they don't have much stomach for it, to put it in terms of digestion. But just creating that space in which there can be an inquiry, and that is what I think you're talking about with the ambiguity. That there's an ambiguity in the consulting room, in that ambiguity is usually not in the bedroom. It's usually not in the kitchen. And how do you create that so that there can be space for an inquiry? And I think it's complicated by the fact that we don't see certain things in the way the other person sees them. But the therapy setup allows the inquiry to take place, and so does, I think, good couples therapy set up an environment where there's a degree of ambiguity that wasn't there when the people were coming into the room. The idea is often couples say, I know you like the back of my hand. Well, probably not, because of the subjectivity aspect of the way our perceptions work. So
can I come in
yes,
here?
please,
Yes, I mean,
please,
I think there are a couple of points. I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying. I was kind of in my mind. I remember that lovely phrase that Iris Murdoch, and it's relevant to what we were talking about earlier. Of course, she developed dementia, but Iris Murdoch's husband, John Bailey, I think
John Bailey.
I think he said something like, "Well, marriage is growing apart together."
Yeah.
So if we come back to this kind of relational neuroscience idea and the idea of the duets for one, I think you could say a kind of falling in love phase of a relationship. There's a kind of, there is a duet for one. There is a sense in which a kind of joint self is created. And then there's a moment of disillusionment. And that's often actually when a relationship either sort of solidifies and turns into a marriage or falls apart. And the moment of disillusionment, and I think there is a sort of psychoanalytic aspect to this, which I think is to do with loss and bereavement. And there's a kind of, it's very painful. It can be very painful. And of course, one comes across people and clients who kind of really can only survive if they're in this kind of in-love phase, and therefore they have endless sort of love affairs, which then sort of fall apart and they move on to the next one because they've got to be in this kind of, they can't sort of cope with the pain of loss. But I think there's a kind of sense, I mean, I totally agree with you, that you sort of, perhaps I'm distorting autobiographically, but I think it's a more general point. The longer you're married to someone, the less you really know them. And the more surprised you are by them.
If you actually are relating to them.
Yes, but I think there's a mutual individuation. In other words, I think so that one really has to think of a kind of life cycle of a marriage or of a long-term relationship. And there is the duet for one aspect. There is the sort of sadness, I mean, the ultimate sort of sadness is, that you're married to this person and not to that person, as it were. I mean, I remember when I was sort of an undergraduate reading a book by E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class. He was a historian. I think he was very happily married to his wife, was another historian. But I noticed that he wrote in the introduction, I dedicate this book to my wife, Dorothy, to whom I'm related by the accident of marriage. And there is a sense in which obviously a marriage is a kind of accident. But I think if we come back to the consulting room, I think there's an aspect there where it's, in a way, it's where the accommodation, if we go back to Piaget, has to stop. So in other words, you have there's a kind of honeymoon phase often with therapy, not always, but I mean, there's often a honeymoon phase in therapy. And then suddenly, as it were, well, in my patient's case, he suddenly discovers I'm married. There's a kind of roadblock. You suddenly discover that this therapist isn't really the person you thought he or she was. And again, rather like a marriage, the therapy can then fall apart at that point. But equally, that is the moment at which therapy can begin, because then you're beginning to explore, as it were, what the top-down assumptions that this person makes about the world truly are, and how they deal with the confounding of those top-down assumptions, and therefore how these can, as it were, be modified or made more complex, and therefore make your prediction errors minimized. So anyway, that's sort of where we are. Again, I haven't sort of run out of things to say, but
well,
I find myself.
I haven't either, but because I want to take a little turn, but I want to be sure that is there more to say about the therapy process? I'm going to turn into the issue of secure attachment because I wanted to have a conversation with you about that before we leave. But is there more to say? Because I'm thinking a little bit of Mark Solms here, and some of the. It seems like some of the things you're saying, reminding me of Mark Solms's work about defense mechanisms. And this is where I want to go a little bit, because I feel that how do I want to say this? That the defense mechanisms, or the ways that people adapt through, trying to minimize, let's say, chaotic energy in their lives, or however you want to put it, that they adapt in ways that also minimize their ability to be in contact with their lives. They are inherently trying to survive and protect themselves, and it makes sense that they don't see, hear, and feel certain things, and sometimes that can lead to excessive alienation, and sometimes it can lead to sort of excessive self-enclosure, and so on and so forth. As they go through the process in therapy, individual therapy here I'm thinking of, I think what happens is that somehow they're able to study their own personalities under the right circumstances. And it's not as though the personality changes. I mean, I often say to people, this is not surgery on your personality, but what happens is that there's a capacity to know oneself in a way that allows you greater compassion for yourself, or greater, let's say, friendship towards yourself. And then that allows for more flexibility, more of this inquiry or ambiguity about exactly who you are, so you get more interested. So it's something about in the process of therapy where if I had, when people ask me in the beginning, well, sort of what's the goal of this? I mean, this may seem overly simplified, but I feel like it's pretty true, that you become a friend to yourself, that you come to know yourself and accept yourself. And some of that's really disappointing, but then you actually can take yourself around, do things with yourself that you hadn't been able to do previously. But it has something to do with this creating an environment in which these various things can happen that we've been talking about, that there can be enough ambiguity that that person has a little bit of curiosity or something. And I don't know how this fits exactly with the free energy principle in the that's what I would kind of get to.
Well, that. A couple of points. I mean, of course, we all need. I mean, I'm not even terribly happy with the phrase, although you just can't escape it, defense mechanisms. But I like to think about it. I think of the psychological immune system.
Yes.
We all need to stay safe. And in order to stay safe, depending on the circumstances in which we've found ourselves, we find various strategies. I would say I like to think of it more in terms of trade-offs. You might say, in order to survive, let's say, going back to the example of someone who has sort of multiple relationships, and whenever the sort of in-love phase comes to an end, because I've just mentioned that as an example, you might say, well, there's a kind of trade-off there where you sort of say, well, I cannot bear a feeling of loss. I cannot bear a feeling of not being sort of completely idealized by my loved one, let's say. And the pain of that is so great that it's better really for me to use this defense mechanism of never really staying too long in one particular relationship. I'm not quite sure which defense mechanism that would be, but I mean...
well, it's something like splitting in projective identification.
Yes,
or
exactly. So, I mean, I think there's an inventory of defense mechanisms that people use in different circumstances, and I don't see these as kind of, inverted commas, bad. They're trade-offs, and from an evolutionary point of view, we're designed always to sort of make the best compromise we can in the environment which we find ourselves in. what I think therapy can help with is to allow, as it were, a certain amount of chaos to enter into the equation. Now, normally that chaos, that free energy or chaos, would have to be immediately minimized with the use of the top-down defense mechanisms. But if you've got a hand to hold, metaphorically, of course, if you've got a therapist, if you've got somebody else there, then together, as it were, that chaos can be tolerated, doesn't have to be immediately minimized, and as it were, can lead to a more complex view of yourself. And I suppose in a way you could say making friends with yourself, accepting that you are going to be disappointed by yourself in certain ways, is a more complex view than either thinking of yourself as totally wonderful or thinking of yourself as totally horrible, which are two reasons that people sometimes come into therapy, particularly the latter, of course. So I think there's this kind of complexity aspect. I mean, the way I look at it is there's this kind of hierarchy in which there's a constant conversation going on between, as it were, what comes from below, bottom up, and the model or the way in which we kind of deal with what's coming from below. And I think this self-acquaintance, this getting to know yourself, getting to understand yourself, getting to make friends with yourself, getting to accept yourself, it's what I call top-downing your top-downs. In other words, you start to look at what kind of a person am I? And the moment you're looking at that, then in a way you're detached from it. And you're beginning to say, well, am I really like that under all circumstances, for instance? Or can I develop a more complex model of myself? Yes, I can be an absolute horror at times, but I can actually be very loving at times as well, or whatever it happens to be. Which is not so different, you might say, from the Kleinian model of moving from paranoid schizoid to depressive position.
Right.
But I think it provides a kind of heuristic, I would like to say, a neuroscience basis for that. And therefore, it gives one a kind of confidence that what one's doing actually is sort of scientifically valid. And I think that's something that, anyway, certainly for me, and the sort of background that I come from, is hugely important. So in one sense, I'm not saying anything that's particularly startling or new. I'm saying free association is important, because that's putting you in touch with your sort of bottom-up feelings. I'm saying that model revision is important. Well, that's changing your basic assumptions about yourself. I'm saying that complexity is important. Well, that's no different to saying depressive position. And I'm kind of saying engaging with the world, this agency or action or your push and pull is important. And I'm saying that psychoanalytic therapy, with this kind of combination of holding and ambiguity, provides a context, a prosthesis, if you like. You said right at the beginning, this idea of the extended mind provides, as it were, another mind which you can extend into and therefore get to understand your own mind better. Now, Solms got some... Yes.
Let me just ask you, was your background then Kleinian? Was your training
Kleinian? No, totally middle group.
Middle group,
but my background was, I've always come from, well, I hate to say it, but my God is science. But it's got to be a science that actually takes into account the whole world and not just a very limited fragment of the world. And it seems to me psychological science, this is where, going back to the very beginning of our conversation, where sort of Freud really, I think, might have said, well, neuroscience just isn't sophisticated or complex enough. Therefore, we've got to develop a kind of standalone psychological science. And I'm trying to argue that actually now neuroscience is beginning to be sophisticated enough to provide a kind of framework in which we can understand the things that really matter to us: relationships, love, the difference between psychological health and psychological ill health, what we're doing when we have conversations with people. I mean, I want to find a science that is up to that job, because I think an awful lot of the science that we're offered is kind of a dumbed down.
Yes.
Not that the science is done, it's incredibly complicated and brilliant, but it doesn't actually address what we are interested in.
Well, there used to be that division between the natural sciences and the human sciences.
Yes.
And, where the humans in the sort of race, the natural sciences were the rabbit or the hare, and then the human sciences were the tortoise, and I think that perhaps some of that gap is closing, partly because of the complex computer analyses we have now. It's not just the sort of machinery, but it's also the algorithms that allow for some kind of closing of the gap, or using even a Bayesian statistic is something that I think wouldn't have been wholly possible until recently. And it sort of approaches something that is called Q-sort, or multivariate analysis of a certain sort in psychology, which was allowing for a science of opinions or a science of impressions to come into research that was done particularly on advertising and marketing for many years. It wasn't really being done in psychotherapy, but it was a psychological research that was done on people's opinions and impressions. And I think now that neuroscience and data analysis, and then some other things going on in physics as well, they're coming together somehow in a way that I feel is promising for a more complex and interesting approach to, science really is about prediction, and it's about reliable prediction, building models that allow us to understand the world we're in. And I agree with you. I do think there's something that's promising now that wasn't around, at the turn of the 20th century, just wasn't possible. And that there, with Freud and with Jung also, there was a longing in both of them to be scientists and to do what was scientific. And then they ended up doing maybe more what was clinical, but they had that kind of underlying desire to be doing science, which I assume also, from your saying that your God is science, I assume that was your longing in the beginning, was to be scientific in your approach. Is that correct? Or?
Well, I mean, my two gods actually are science and poetry, and they don't really, and I think they marry or did marry in my work as a psychotherapist.
Yeah, yes.
So anyway, maybe that's not of any great interest to anyone who's viewing this, but do you want to say a bit about, do you want to say a bit about attachment?
Well, I wanted to first just ask you about Mark Solms. I mean, I know that we're going off of the program here, but that's just fine. So I've witnessed Mark Solms debating with Rachel Blas about science and psychoanalysis. I've witnessed it a bit, just once, but I don't fully understand why there is such a debate. I think, I don't know why those should be opposite positions, but I wondered where you sort of see yourself in relation to Mark Solms, and also the debate in psychoanalysis about including a scientific basis for psychoanalytic work. I mean, just if you could just tell me a little bit about how you see your work in that regard, and then we'll go on to the final.
Well, there are two points here, or 2 or 3 points here. I mean, first of all, of course, I hugely admire Mark and what he's done, and I must be very polite about him because he wrote a nice blurb for my book, actually, which you'll find on the back of it. And I think Mark, 2 things I wanted to bring up. I mean, Mark is very, he talks about the so-called hard problem.
Yeah.
And the hard problem is, the science and science and science, but the fact is our phenomenology, our experience of the world is something that seems to have a kind of life of its own, that however much one may sort of, inverted commas, explain it neurologically, it doesn't take away the kind of the redness of red, the isness of is, of our existence, the loveness of love, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So I really value the fact that he takes the hard problem very seriously. And the other thing that I admire Mark for is that he's really thinking about what do we mean by the unconscious.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I think he I'm not familiar enough with his work, or I need to reread his work in order to sort of expound it. So I'm not going to try and do so. But it does enable me to say something about where I think the prediction error minimization, or the free energy approach, says something really interesting about the unconscious, or unconsciousness. Because I think we have to think of unconsciousness in at least 3 or 4 different ways. I mean, there's the obvious point that when we're asleep, we're unconscious. Mm-hmm. So in one sense, consciousness is simply, as it were, booting up the organism. Whether we're, whether it's our dog sitting in front of the fire, or whether it's us getting up in the morning. Secondly, it's quite obvious that there's a vast amount that goes on in our bodies of which we are not conscious,
yes.
Our digestive system, etc. The same applies to the brain, of course. I mean, we don't know what our brain is up to. And thirdly, there's the Freudian unconscious, which in a way we've touched on, which is is relevant to defense mechanisms, is relevant to the specific example I gave about the wedding ring. So in other words, Freudian repression removes perceptions from consciousness in order, as it were, to preserve the integrity of the organism and to minimize free energy. So in that sense, free energy minimization is a kind of another way of talking about one aspect of Freudian, one aspect of free energy minimization is a way of talking about the Freudian repression. But I think the most interesting aspect of the unconscious from a free energy point of view is to think about boundaries and to think about the fact that, in a sense, all we know about the world, it's a kind of Kantian approach to unconsciousness, all we know about the world is what our senses tell us. There's no other way that we can know about the world. So therefore, we are, as it were, unconscious of all aspects of the world other than that was provided either by our sense organs or by extensions of them like microscopes and telescopes, etc. Conversely, the world only knows about us through our agency, through our actions, through our pushings and pullings. And therefore, in one sense, what we're trying to do if we come back to the consulting room, what are we trying to do in the consulting room? We're trying to do 2 things. We're trying, as it were, to wake ourselves up, going back to the sort of wake up aspect, but wake ourselves up to what our sense organs are telling us. And how do we do that? We do it through free association. We do it through asking our clients, as it were, to find a language to talk about their life, about their experience, about what their body is telling us, the way they see the world, or what their feelings are telling us. So that is, in a sense, widening consciousness or encroaching on the unconsciousness that we have of our lives. And the other thing we're encouraging our clients to do is push and pull. In other words, to become agents, to become interested in themselves, to become interested in their worlds and how they've, as it were, created worlds that conform to their preconceptions about that world. Those preconceptions may need to be altered. So going back, I mean, that's a bit of a diversion away from Solms, but I think I'm really kind of admiring the fact that he is prepared to tackle head-on the question of what do we mean by unconscious and conscious life, and has amazingly sort of sophisticated ways of thinking about that.
So I think he has an interesting theory about the brain and where, if there were some location, I mean, myself, I'm sort of more on the Donald Hoffman camp. I actually like his work, and I'm moving in that direction, which is that we won't find consciousness in the brain, so to speak. But listening to Solms talk about the way he understands it connected to affect rather than the cortex, was interesting, and I thought he was raising an important point. I guess where I would want to sort of finish up this part of the conversation is, do you understand why, say, Rachel Bloss, why she wants to debate him, as she has debated him a couple of times, on the issue of, can we bring science into psychoanalysis? Is there a value in that? Or is it really sort of preposterous because it's just a bad fit? I don't know. I don't quite understand. And I tried to ask her this question. I don't understand why you wouldn't want to bring it in. I mean, I can't quite get what the problem is on that side,
Well, I think it's, this brings us on to a whole new topic and something that's really interesting me at the moment, which is epistemology versus ontology. Now, I am no philosopher.
I spent the day yesterday talking about that, and I don't want to get too diverse here, but I'm studying a particular aspect of Buddhist philosophy that's called Yogacara, and it comes from the 3rd to the 5th century in India. That's where it comes from. And what they're trying to do is to move entirely away from ontology into entire epistemology about phenomenal reality. And so
I want to go in the opposite direction.
You want to go towards that?
I want to go away from epistemology towards ontology. In other words, I think if you start thinking about questions of is psychoanalysis scientifically true? Are the propositions of psychoanalysis scientifically true?
Okay.
Can you demonstrate that psychoanalysis has a kind of uniquely a unique form of effectiveness that other psychotherapies don't have? These are all epistemological questions of truth, that I think psychoanalysis comes out rather badly from that. If you, on the other hand, think about ontology, if you think about becoming, if you think about process, if you think about the psychoanalytic relationship as a sort of living being, as one that, as it were, taps into the becoming, to the constant movement of life, then I think psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic praxis has a sort of an extraordinary, interesting kind of contribution to make. And one shouldn't really talk about the people you're kind of, reading at the moment, because it's a bit like assimilation and accommodation, and I haven't fully assimilated. But Elizabeth Gross is a wonderful feminist philosopher. Has written a book called The Incorporeal, I don't know how to pronounce it. And she's got a very interesting book on Darwin as well. But she, as it were, is very influenced by a kind of tradition that goes back to the Stoics, goes through Spinoza and Nietzsche, and then to Deleuze and Guattari. And the whole sort of thrust of this is an approach which is looking, as it were, at the movement of the mind and the movement of life itself, as opposed to entities. And as an entity, I think I'm sort of, I think one sort of might be on a hiding to nothing if one's trying to sort of say there is, as it were, scientific truth in psychoanalysis. If, on the other hand, one says that it's a kind of ontology, it's a way of thinking about living and thinking about ethical living and thinking about complexity, then I think one is on a much, much more interesting and possibly much firmer ground.
Interesting, but
and that does take one in the direction of Buddhism, actually. That's why I'm interested, because I think in a way, one of the whole sort of aspects of Buddhism is the idea of change, the idea of fluidity, the idea of not clinging, as it were, to entities, not clinging to epistemologies, but as it were, being able to sort of accept the endless change that is inherent in all living and indeed non-living beings.
When you're speaking about it, it seems like you're the way I would see it, I assume ontology is about the existence of things, and epistemology is about how we know that things are or exist. But the way that you're describing your views of psychoanalysis, it's, to me, I would use the idea of a biology almost, that that it enters into the experience of living from the perspective of changing the way we live, which includes our agency and our existence. But the reason that Yogacara was trying to move away from ontology is that there was a big debate in the early couple of centuries in India about the existence of the mind, whether the mind was sort of like a substance, like a thing, or was it more like something that was not material, that was like a process. And so, the early position is that consciousness arises in these tiny little units that are like a 17th of a second, and that there are certain conditions that come together in those units. And by the time you get around to the 3rd to the 5th century in Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy, there's the recognition of the unconscious. Before that, it was just moment to moment to moment arising of consciousness. But they knew there was something that was habitual in it, that carried this sort of model of a self, an individual self. But they couldn't come to the notion of how does that get carried, so that eventually this new group comes up and says, well, there's an unconscious, there's something that's happening that carries
below the surface.
That's below the surface. Before that,
yes.
it was all momentary. It's moment to moment to moment.
That was a kind of granular, moving from a kind of granular approach
That's
to a
right.
sort of a flowing river-like approach.
And
I'm very aware, Polly, of time, because we're going to have 2 hours, and we're coming up to 8. So
yes,
are there any? We've only got a few more minutes.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to give you this final question about the let's say I don't know the word valorizing or idealizing of secure attachment. I've been very, very interested in attachment research from its beginnings and very supportive of it. And then along in the last few years or so, I've become uncomfortable with kind of valorizing of secure attachment, as though secure attachment would be a panacea for the problems of life. And I see this happening in couples therapy, like emotion-focused therapy, where they're really trying to impose the model of a secure attachment on relationships, which is a sort of exhorting of people to become like it looks like you have a secure attachment. You can speak about your needs, the other person can respond to your needs, etc. So I just wondered, what you would have to say about how the idea of a secure base has evolved in relation to, let's say, a kind of hyper-valuing of secure attachment, and where does that go, or how do you view that? Or
no, I totally agree with you, and I think we're sort of slightly prisoners of the language, because you can't get away from that secure is a kind of a word that is associated with good, warm feelings, and insecure doesn't feel good at all. Whereas in fact, as we know, these are, if you take a non-clinical population, as Mary Ainsworth did back in the 1950s and 60s, and apply the strange situation to the kids in those suburban families, you'll find about 60 to 65% will be classified as secure, and about 20% classified as avoidant, and the rest as anxiously attached. In other words, these are different ways of living. And then they do have sort of consequences, and we have to face the fact that adverse circumstances, particularly adverse circumstances, once disorganized attachment had been described, that adverse circumstances does tend to correlate with or with disorganized attachment, and the long-term consequences of, if you as a child are classified as having disorganized attachment, are that your kind of chances in life in a number of different ways are going to be compromised to an extent. And I mean, there's absolutely incontrovertible research, which adverse life events research, which has got nothing to do with attachment at all, has shown that adverse life events in childhood affect your chances in life in terms of your income and chances in life of your physical and mental health. And sort of adverse life events on the whole, it depends on how they are kind of metabolized. But if they're metabolized in ways that are suboptimal, you may then be classified as having insecure attachment, especially disorganized attachment. So there's sort of no getting away from the fact that life experience has consequences. And after all, that is in a way the fundamental basis of psychoanalysis. Having said all that, it's kind of become, it can so easily become dumbed down for a start. It can so easily become very superficial. The way I tend now to think about it is that actually all of us have within us the potentiality for forming relationships that are secure and forming relationships that are insecure. We have the potential for avoidance, the potential for anxious attachment, and indeed the potential for disorganization, depending on the context in which we find ourselves. I mean, I always describe myself as someone who's fundamentally avoidant, but have achieved a kind of degree of earned security, partly through my analysis and partly through, to use the phrase I used earlier, the accident of marriage. So in a general way, I mean, there is an issue in the attachment world these days as to whether the concept as a heuristic has sort of played itself out to an extent. And there are leading attachment researchers, including Elizabeth Means and to some extent Peter Fonagy, who haven't exactly turned their back on attachment, but they, Fonagy just says, well, you don't get research grants through using attachment measures these days. So there is a sense in which there's kind of a moving on from attachment to an extent, I would say. And that's not, you might say, it's back to assimilation and accommodation, as it were, that we've been accommodating to attachment for the last 50 years, and now it's kind of assimilated. Right. We all jolly well know that the parameters of secure attachment, sensitivity, responsiveness, respect for another's autonomy, etc. These are sort of the kinds of developmental experiences which, if children have these developmental experiences, it does build up a reservoir of resilience, which would enable them to survive the sort of vicissitudes of living. Fonagy is very keen now on what he calls epistemic trust. That goes back to epistemology. In other words, what he thinks is crucial is, as it were, the extent to which a child, a developing child, is able to trust their caregiver as someone who is going to sort of mediate the world to them in a way that is truthful and accurate, non-narcissistic, and so on. So there's a bit of a movement away from these sort of standard classical attachment categories even. And of course, as clinicians, I think one of the problems clinicians have always found with attachment is that these categories are, even the subcategories are a pretty broad brush. But on the other hand, I think what we're doing as therapists, or what good therapists are doing, actually does come under can accurately just be described as providing a sort of an environment, an ambience, a milieu of secure attachment. And what are the features of secure attachment? It's empathy, responsiveness, and a kind of respect for the other,
Mm-hmm.
and for their autonomy, not trying to control them, not trying to sort of make them into something. So with your description of this valorization of attachment, it sounds to me as though, rather than, as it were, a kind of stance of acceptance and, to an extent, not knowing, there is a kind of imposition of a top-down model that doesn't correspond with this idea that there's a kind of continuous conversation between bottom-up, top-down, whether that's held within an individual or whether it's held in a therapeutic relationship.
So that's a lovely place actually to end, because I think that yes, that epistemic trust also seems like a good summary of what you were describing as the relationship of that's not too much top down or too much bottom up, but is able to inquire into that situation and condition. And I think that what I like very much about the model that you're working with is that it seems to me to bring back into a scientific framework what really was, let's say, in the, initial aim for psychoanalysis, that psychoanalysis would be a sort of science of the mind, where there could be a deep and what I would call objective inquiry. That it's objective in the sense that it's not steeped in a particular value. Like we always need to be empathic, or we always need to be, confrontive, or whatever it is. It's more that it sets an environment, I think, as a psychoanalytic therapy does. That would make for epistemic trust. Yes, please add to that.
Well, just to sort of underline and say goodbye. I mean, I think what you're saying makes me think of the idea that is so important, which is this kind of the stance of not knowing, the stance of inquiry, and thereby, as it were, allowing for sufficient prediction error for it to be examined. And I usually end my little talks when I talk about this, and I show the Munch picture of the scream, and I contrast that with somebody who has a look of amazed and pleasant surprise on their face. So we're trying to turn, as it were, trauma into surprise. We're trying to turn, and you can only do that relationally. It's something that's really almost impossible to do on your own. But Polly, anyway, I think I must go.
It's been a lovely conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for yes. Okay. Well, namaste, and maybe we'll bump into each other somewhere.
Oh, I think we will. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.